Good afternoon. I'm Judith Tucker. I'm a professor in the Department of History and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies here at Georgetown University. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues in African and Arab Studies to this panel on race and racism in Africa and the Middle East. And the panel is being held today in connection with the Scholars Strike to show our support for Black Lives Matter and for protests against police violence, racialized violence, racism, and white supremacy. The event is co-sponsored by the African Studies Program and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies here at Georgetown University. And I also want to give special thanks to Maddie Fisher and to Allison Jenkins for their help in organizing and facilitating this event. We are thrilled and we are very grateful to be hosting three scholars who are superbly placed to speak with us about race and racism in Africa and the Middle East. And these are subjects which many scholars of the region, and I include myself among them, have been far too slow to engage. So I will introduce each of our speakers very briefly at the beginning. Each one will speak for 15 to 20 minutes or so, and then after that we will open the floor to questions. First, Dr. Khaled Esseissah, who is the assistant teaching professor in the African Studies program here at Georgetown. And Dr. Khaled specializes in modern African history with a special focus on the social, intellectual, and religious initiatives of African Muslims. His current book project concerns the social transformation associated with the abolition of slavery in Mauritania, with a focus on the recent history of the Harāṭīn community and its diaspora. He will be followed by Dr. Eve Trout-Powell, who is a professor of history coming to us from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Eve is a cultural historian. She is the author of several books, among them A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egypt, Great Britain, and the Mastery of the Sudan. She is also co-editor of The African Diaspora in the Mediterranean Lands of Islam. And her most recent book is Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement in Egypt, Sudan, and the Late Ottoman Empire. She is now working on a book about the visual culture of slavery in the Middle East, which will explore painting and photography about African and Circassian slavery in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. And lastly, we have Trishula Patel, who is a PhD candidate in history here at Georgetown. And Trish Patel is currently working on her dissertation entitled Becoming Zimbabwean, A History of Indians in Zimbabwe, 1890 to 1980. Her research interests include the history of race and segregation in the British Empire and the South Asian diaspora in Africa. And she has written extensively on South Asian migration and integration in African nations. So I thank them all three of them, for the gift of their time and knowledge, and turn first to Dr. Khaled.
So thank you so much, Professor Tucker, for that introduction. Thank you, Professor Smith, Professor Davis, for inviting me to be on this panel. I am very pleased to be part of this long overdue conversation on race and racism in the Middle East and Africa. We are so grateful for the African Studies Program and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for taking this initiative. So I'm gonna start. So the questions that were given to us, 3 questions by Professor Tucker, and I'll try to address those questions with the time that I have. First question is, how does race figure in the context that I work in, which is Northwest Africa, particularly in a country like Mauritania? So when I was thinking about this question, I'm thinking about my own personal background and what I bring to this conversation. I was born and raised in Mauritania, and which is, I think, a perfect place to start to examine these issues, race and racism in both the Arab world and African societies, but also to examine the use of status, religion, and even Islamic knowledge in constructing otherness and difference. I'm also someone who comes to this with my, graduate training. I did my graduate studies in the United States, both my master in American culture studies, but also my PhD in African history and minoring in African American and African diaspora studies. So both my personal background and my academic training give me a useful perspective to examine racism and prejudice in this area. And so Mauritania, this is, as you see on the map, Mauritania is straddled, both in terms of geographically, you see Mauritania straddles both North and West Africa south of the Sahara, the Sahara al-Kubra, the Great Sahara Desert. So in terms of that's the geographical location. And Mauritania, think of this, the first president of Mauritania who used to call Mauritania as un trait d'union. That's a bridge between both Africa south of the Sahara, but also in terms of Africa, North Africa. In terms of the populations, the ethnicities and the groups that have inhabited Mauritania, have inhabited this geographical space, both are a mix of Arab, Amazigh. Sometimes they are called the Berber, but the preferred term that they use for themselves is Amazigh. And then you have non-Arabophone groups, ethnic groups that include the Soninke, the Wolof, and the Fulfulde. So these are in terms of ethnic groups. So you see that's in Mauritania. And the Sahara has always been seen as a bridge historically, connecting both Africa south of the Sahara and also connecting North and the Middle East in terms of population, in terms of the geographical location. So when I think, I'm going to get to the question, when I think about this concept of race and racism, for a long time in Mauritania, but also in other parts of Africa, people have thought of, this idea of race as a colonial imposition, as a colonial invention, and there's nothing to do with the reality. But at least for the last 20 years, scholars have been able to challenge that notion and to go and look at, pre-colonial concept of race. And you have the work of, historian like Bruce Holt, but you have the work of Shouqi Ahmed and others who have been challenging this notion that, Africans have their own ideas of race, maybe different from the Western concept of race, and I'll say that a little bit about that. But racial ideas, in Mauritanian context and in other contexts that I study, skin color matters, phenotypes matters in this context. Those who have light complexions usually see themselves as superior than those who have dark complexions. Blackness in the writing, if you look at the writing of Arab geographers and Arab scholars like Ibn Khaldun, Ibn al-Hawqal, Ibn Battuta, and others, you look at their writings, they often use derogatory terms referring to Black people. And Blackness is associated with inferiority. And even today, people get treated based on their skin color. And I'll say a little bit about the ethnicity that I'm talking about here. So as you see, in Mauritania, you have the non-Arabophone groups that are, sometimes defined as the Moor or the Moorish society. This is a mix of Arab and Berber and then Africans. And they identify themselves as Bizan, and the Bizan means white. This is referring to light skin Arabs and Berbers, or those who are mixed of that ancestry. And this is even, I mentioned the writing of Arab geographers who refer to Africa south of the Sahara as the land of the black, Bilad Sudan. So you have this idea of Bizan who are white, and then the Sudan referring to non-Arabs and non-Berbers, and who are in Mauritania. I mentioned these three groups that that you find in Mauritania: the Soninke and the Wolof and the Fulfulde. But it's very important also to understand in that idea of Bizan as an ethnicity that skin color. The term refers to one status. So people are defined by their status as rather than their people refer to one status as defined by patrilineal descent, not necessarily their color. And the map on the screen, you see these two individuals. These are, when we think of them in America, we'll see these two individuals as black because of that idea of one blood drop rule, right? But these are, the gentleman on the left is a very prominent, these both are nobilities, and these both are identified as Arabs. Both have, one of them, as you see in the Arabic language, there is a very prominent Sufi sheikh and Sufi saint. And the other one is a very prominent Arab warriors who played a very significant role in the 20th century Mauritania. The reason why I'm saying this, bringing this, is people often use this idea like the person got a black skin, but they're not black because they are defined by their patrilineal descent. So this is where we see race as a Western concept is very, it's very useful as a category of historical analysis, but it's not sufficient to understand the complexity of the Saharan reality. And so what I mean by that is there are other ideologies that people have mobilized to support, for instance, enslavement, to support slavery, or to create, promote, and maintain hierarchical structures in society. These ideologies were not constricted to race. So it's important to pay attention to these ideologies that are formed outside the common role of race as we understand it in the West. For example, the concept of nasab, al-ansab, genealogy, is very important. So one is tracing their family, and this is very important in the Mauritanian context, is one people tracing their family the lineage to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or to the family of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, is a very central, both in historical and contemporary discourse about construction distinction between ethnic groups, between the nobles and the non-nobles. For example, there are those within the Byzantine society that I already talked about, those who are not dark-skinned people, but they occupy a marginalized position within that society because they are not part of, they cannot trace their lineage to the Prophet Muhammad. They are not part of the Sharif, or they are not part of those who could able to trace their lineage to an important Islamic religious figure. So race, what you see, race is very limiting when we use it in this context. Also, this concept of genealogy is not only used by the Byzantine. There are non-Arabophone groups who use also this concept of genealogy. And I can give the example of the Sunjata Keita family. This is the empire, the empire of Mali, the founder of the empire of Mali, and his descendant. They trace their lineage to Bilal ibn Rabah, who is the first Muslim slave who was manumitted and became the first mu'adhin, the person to call the adhan. So you see that in non-Arabophone group, this is very important, this idea of genealogy. The other concept that is important also here, that will take us beyond the concept of race, is the concept of blood purity. People think of, there are people who think they are nobles because their blood is pure. And there are, they look down and there is the idea of the slave blood. And this is a concept that exists in other contexts, not only in Mauritania, but in Senegal, in Mali, but also in Sudan. This idea of those who have slave blood, even if they are free and they are manumitted, they emancipated, they still have that blood within them. So they retain that status. So skin color is not only one to determine people's social status, but birthmark, family lineage are also important. The third category, the third important dimension is Islamic knowledge. People use knowledge to create also hierarchical structures and to maintain them. So those who come from a family of scholars, those who come from the family of saints, they think they are superior, and they act on that because of their families or their Islamic knowledge. They think they have better DNA than others, and this is still very present today in Mauritania and in other places. Now, it's very important to mention here that Islam is against all form of social and racial discrimination, and this is in the Quran. There are many passages in the Quran that talk about that. There is the hadith also, the common hadith that gets cited by Muslims, by imams and scholars, that mention that there is no superiority between an Arab and non-Arab. There is no superiority between a black man and a white man. And it gets mentioned. And there are many examples that I can mention. I can go back in the Q&A. But it's very important to mention the stand of Islam on this. But of course, there are the theory and there is the practice. There is what is in the text. And in the text, in the Quran, and what is in the practice is different. People use these ideas to create these differences and otherness. The second question that I want to address is this idea of race, how it's connected to the idea of state oppression and inequality. And this is very important. And this is where you see the identity is the Arab identity or Arabness. Concept of Arabness is connected to social and political and economic marginalization of non-Arabophone groups. This idea, the promotion of Arabness and being an Arab, or how to be part of the Arabs. This is given the fact that the Bizan, who see themselves as Arabs, are the elite in Mauritania, and they are the decision makers. They are the one who have the power, and this is in the independence of Mauritania in 1966. So this is the emergence, the solidification of Arab identity at the state level, where Mauritanians elite portray Mauritania as an Arab nation, trying to kind of sideline its African heritage, sideline, to emphasize the Arabic as the language. This kind of created a lot of resentment from the people who are not part of the Arab or the Bizan community. The Soninke, the Wolof, they see themselves as being marginalized by the state, who try to impose an Arab identity. So that's where you see also this connection with the Arabness that has an impact, and the Arabness become a political identity at the state level. And this is where one area that there is still a lot of debate about is the Arabic used as the official language of Mauritania, despite the fact there are a lot of groups who are not Arabs and who don't speak Arabic. But it's they see it as imposed on them and then the state. And there was a lot of, sometimes that created actually incidents where it was very violent. And their violence that was exercised on this community, and they were victim of the violence of the state. So that's where it's connected. You see this Arabness connected to the state. That's also, you see this in contemporary Mauritania, you see this racism or racist kind of racial discourse. You see it in terms of the expressions, alive in the expression. For example, it's still very common for Arabs, people who see themselves as Arab, to use derogatory terms like abd, terms like zunji, terms like khadim. Khadim is basically in Arabic means servant, but in the Mauritanian context it means enslaved woman. So these terms are very common. The area where you still also see problems is intermarriage between the Bizan and the non-Arabophone groups is not common. This is not mandated by the law, but it's still very, it's part of the social practices. It's not common to see that. So, and this is where you see a lot of activism. This is connected to the idea of activism. And there are a lot of people who are pushing against the oppression from the state and pushing against all this kind of discourse. And the figure that I want to mention here, because of the interest of time, is this figure in the middle, who is very prominent, he's very known. This is because, it's not because he's the only one there. There are so many people who came before him, but he seems to be the only one who was able to garner a lot of attention, international attention, local attention. He gained a lot of accolades, and he is very controversial in Mauritania. But he also somebody who has a large following, and he ran for election twice. He came in the second position. His name is Biram Dawul Ubaid. He recently gave this speech where he described Mauritania as the apartheid system in West Africa. He used that. It's not the first time he does that. He does it, in Mauritania before that, but it's the first time on international stage he used that term. Again, racism is not mandated by law in Mauritania. There is no institutionalized racism, but he does it because apartheid gets attention. It's just like when you use the term slavery, it gets attention. So he wants to highlight this social marginalization and economic marginalization that I talked about earlier. He himself is a member of the parliament, and he has run to election, and he is so he is the one who seems to be gaining a lot of attention, and he pushing against all these issues of racial discrimination, social discrimination, and also the legacy of slavery that still exists in Mauritania. There is a lot of debate about slavery. Most of the attention that Mauritania gets is about slavery. Before I address the last question, and I want to mention one point, and I can talk more about this, is this idea of political definition of Arabness. The irony is Mauritanians elite have always wanted to present themselves as an Arab nation. The problem is there is also a pushback from the Arab states who don't see Mauritania as part of the Arab world, who see Mauritania as a country that is very far away outside the Arab world. And the recent example, in 2016, Mauritania held the summit, the Arab League Summit. It's the first time to organize that, so it was an opportunity for Mauritania to showcase its Arab culture, its Arab identity. The problem is the majority of Arab leaders did not attend. One minister from Lebanon, he actually insulted Mauritania and described it as a miserable nation that does not belong to the Arab world. And the summit was cut short. So you see Mauritania, even the elite trying to present themselves as an Arab at the state level, the Arab state don't accept it. And you see this. I actually had a friend from Iraq who told me that, look, Mauritania, Sudan, these countries are not part from the Arab. They are not Arabs. These are not part of an Arab al-Aqha. They are not from the pure Arabs. These are on the sideline. So you see these dynamics. Even in Mauritania, the emphasis a lot on Arabness. They still get the push and not recognized by the larger Arab world. Of course, there are exceptions, and I can talk about those exceptions in the Q&A. The last thing that I want to mention is this linkage between the current movement from Black Lives Matters and what's happening in the context that they work on. I think it's too early to talk about Black Lives Matter and how Black Lives Matter has an impact on what's happening in Mauritania. What I want to say is racial, what I see an impact is here in the United States among the Muslim community. What I already see the protests and what's happening with Black Lives Matter having serious pushing the Muslim community to discuss the issue of racism and discrimination that exists within the Muslim community, that sometimes people don't want to talk about it. The imams don't want to talk about it, and the clerics don't want to talk about it, because every time there is a discussion, there is a racism against African-American Muslims. in the mosque, in Muslim institutions, Muslim circles, racism against African Muslims that exists within the Muslim community that's not getting a lot of attention. And I think with this movement that's happening right now, I think that now I see people are talking about it beyond the idea of just, oh, there is no racism in Islam because Islam forbids it. That's just the practice, but in reality, it's much more complicated than that. That's all of it. I'll stop here and thank you very much. And excuse me for taking a long time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll just turn immediately to Dr. Trout-Powell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Judith and Dr. Fida and everybody who organized this. And I also want to thank my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Anthea Butler, who co-sponsored this idea. And thank you, Dr. Khaled. That was really fascinating. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Almost Dr. Trish. So I'm going to actually go to the activism question first, because while I agree with you, Judith, that these discussions are often overdue, what I am so thrilled to see especially in this new generation of young academics is not only a personal attention, but an academic attention to race in Africa and in the Middle East. And when I first started out in the early 80s, there were people who were doing this work, but it's nowhere near the numbers of people who are doing this now. And I really consider that to be an important offshoot of activism. And the fact that I have not only my students, but many people, younger academics around, are beginning to really deeply explore these questions, and that's very important. And so that's one of the places where I think the activism is really enabling us in the classroom to make sure that not only our voice is heard and that Black voices are heard, not just, hey, I'm a Black person and I have something to say, but hey, I am of African descent and I have work to show you, and I have projects to show you, and important intellectual research that helps keep these experiences alive and remembered. So I'm just really moved to Dr. Khaled to hear particularly what you're working on, because Mauritania has not crossed into Middle East studies, and it needs to. And I really appreciate the links that you're making. So to start now, to go to the one more thing about state repression, the inequality of systemic racism. That's why we need to have more scholars of color. And these universities have, I'm sorry to say, with many kinds of different approaches to admissions and reliances on SATs, and I actually believe the GRE is outdated, that universities need to be at the forefront of this kind of intellectual activism, because if we're not bringing in more and more people of different voices who have experiences unparalleled in our current faculties, we're missing a golden opportunity to really make universities more responsible, in politically responsible. So how does race and racism figure into the context in which I have worked? To start off with, I am African American. When I went into Middle East Studies, which was I started in 1986, there were a few people who really took me seriously as I began to want to talk about race. And the more I began to work on my dissertation about Egypt's constructions of race and being a colonized colonizer vis-a-vis the Sudan and the British, many people thought I was an unwelcome outsider who was imposing my own construction of race, although no one could tell me what that was, and I'm still working it out. People were telling me that I was importing the situation in the United States onto Egypt, onto Sudan, later onto Lebanon, onto Israel. You name the country. And last year at Mesa, we had a big roundtable about this that Shireen Sekali organized. And I'm so sorry to say that some of these things kept coming up, and that one scholar actually sort of denounced the work that people are doing, whether they're my generation or younger, by very, very condescendingly say, well, you need to learn the languages of these places. And people were from the places, I mean, their Arabic or their Turkish was better than his. And so that's one place, not taking seriously the work of Black folks, whether they call themselves Black in an American context or call themselves Black or don't call themselves Black, but are looking at this, but present to the academic world as Black, not being taken seriously. And that has and it still happens. And, I'm very lucky. I got through, and I had mentors who believed in me. But it's still very uncomfortable for many graduate students, and very uncomfortable for many people. And this is ridiculous. And so that's one place about how racism affects the context that I work in. My work, even though I am now broadening a little bit, my work has centered for most of my career on Egypt and Sudan, and on that part of the Nile Valley. And I was sort of introduced to the idea that there was racism in Egypt through the word I would hear inflicted upon my friends of mine who were from South Sudan, the word abid. And the response that my friends would have, and these were people in their early 20s, mid 20s, I mean, we've grown older together, who, when they heard that word, and I don't know what it was like when they heard that word, if they were in groups of other Dinka or other Azande, but when they were, but I know that they were in fights a lot. When they were with me, it was such an embarrassment. And I remember my first translation, just looking at the reaction of my friend Yar in particular, was, boy, the way she reacted, that word sounds a lot like the N-word to me, or it certainly seems to have the impact of the N-word to me. And when I would ask my Egyptian friends or my teachers, 90% of them would say, it's a joke. We don't mean it. We really don't mean it. It's a joke. So the thing with jokes is that you have to wonder who's laughing at the jokes, and if the people you are referring to in the joke are stony-faced when you say this, then clearly this is not a fair joke. And I remember I was looking at, and this would have been later this would have been in the early 90s. I was looking at plays in the National Theater Archive in Cairo, and these were kind of funny plays starring Ali El-Qassar, who used to portray himself as a Nubian, the one and only Egyptian Nubian. And his plays are very funny, and the music to them, the music was done by Said Darwish, and this is all considered a national treasure. But I had a hard time understanding the humor, and I would bring it over to the American Research Center in Egypt, where a lot of people working there were Nubian. And I would bring it to another friend who really opened up his heart to my little boy while my husband and I were both working. And I would show these transcripts and ask them to read it out loud. And it was so funny because in the theater, people were laughing hysterically, but among Nubians, it wasn't funny. And so I think that these are ways in which you experience what racism is, and who holds the master narrative defining who these jokes and these stories can be told about, and then who is trying to push against them. I do believe that there are great differences in the history of race and slavery across the entire world. I also believe that most of the societies we call capitalistic are based on slavery and the slave trade beginning very early on. Africans were stolen from Senegal, from what we now call Senegal, etc., since the 16th century, certainly in the Caribbean. I think there are very many different stories to tell, but I think that wherever you have a history of slavery, it is followed by a history of this kind of racism. The vocabulary might be different. I believe in the Nile Valley that many of the wrongful ideas about race that people developed came from slave traders who just simply decided, came from the Jalabin, who decided who was this, who didn't look like they were monotheistic, etc. And so I think this is something that we need to explore, sort of, instead of always saying that this came from the British and it came from the French, and I'm not saying they didn't infect a lot with their own virulent forms of racism, but that it often came from other kinds of vocabularies. I mean, the Ottomans certainly got their knowledge of this from slave traders who were all over the world, and so thinking about these vocabularies is really important. And I've also found, I guess you all know that early this spring, before we were all imprisoned by this virus, early this spring there were a lot of reports coming out of Lebanon, Morocco, Cairo, other places in the Gulf, of performers singing or telling comedy in blackface. Then there was a lot of attention to this in Arabic language news, in Al Jazeera, and in talking about it and in thinking about it, I think that one of the issues that comes up that keeps this racism unquestioned is that people don't often know what the history of the slavery was. Even those who are descended from slaves don't necessarily know. And this was very different for me as I grew up during the time of Black Power, when in the New York City public school system, suddenly you had to really learn about Frederick Douglass. This did not happen to my mother. This did not happen to my grandmother. So it's again, I'm focusing back on the importance of education about this, but I think that in many curricula across the Middle East and in Africa, and look, and it, in Europe as well, and we're not finished here in Latin America, the history of slavery and the impact of slavery is really crucial to knowing. I'm not saying every culture has to have a roots moment, but a lot of people don't know. They don't know, they don't understand it. They don't see the impact, and it's painful. I made a huge mistake when I was interviewing Sudanese refugees for my second book, Tell This in My Memory, of talking about a Sudanese former slave who became a saint. I was at her center, the Saint Bakhita Center, and this was in Abbasiyah in Cairo, and I made this horrible mistake of talking about what is your relationship to slavery. I mean, it came out to them as such an insult, whereas to me, I meant it as a compliment. So we always have to learn how to translate and carefully see the parameters of how people not only experience racism but respond to it. which keeps me as a lifelong student of racism. Finally, to the question about linkages, and I agree with Dr. Khaled that it is early to see where Black Lives Matter is reaching in the Middle East and in parts of Africa. I would say that the one place that I think there have been pretty clear linkages in terms of media and certainly in terms of signs and protest have been among Palestinians. And I think the equation between George Floyd and the young man Iyad, who was shot by Israeli police unnecessarily, has been something that in the West Bank has been made quite clear. And I did notice that these pictures were linked in some of the protests that I saw in Philadelphia. And the use of the keffiyeh among many Black Lives Matter protesters, to me, has been what I hope is an indication of links being made. But I do agree that I hope that these linkages broaden and deepen. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Eve. And finally, we will turn to Trish Patel, almost doctor. Yeah.
Yes, almost there. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here, and especially to the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and African Studies program for inviting me, and thank you to Dr. Tucker for the introduction. By way of a more extended introduction, I'm from Zimbabwe, and so my dissertation and my research was inspired in part by my own family and the stories of my own ancestors. And I think my parents are listening in, so I'm extra nervous today. But for me, what started as an exploration of the history of the sort of one minority community turned into a larger investigation into the history of race and institutions of segregation in Southern Rhodesia. So a bit of quick background. The focus of my research is the history of Indians in Zimbabwe. And Indians began migrating voluntarily to what was then Southern Rhodesia in the 1890s. The earliest migrant I've tracked came to Beira in Mozambique in 1891, and then to the eastern border with Southern Rhodesia in 1893. They were mostly from Gujarat, and they were mostly farmers, and they were enticed by the promise of gold that they'd heard about from their networks. But instead, what they find is that mining and farming are restricted. So instead, what they do is they set up small trading stands and vegetable gardens on white farmers' land, and eventually get pushed out of the rural areas by the Land Apportionment Act of 1930. So what they do is they become general traders instead. And in urban spaces, such as cities like Bulawayo, Indian trading streets like what we call Lobengula Street were literally physical frontier zones between the Black and white populations of the city. Eventually, these male migrants brought their wives and minor children over from Gujarat, and the new immigration of adult males was restricted after Southern Rhodesia became a self-governing colony in 1923. Since then, the population has never been more than 1% of the total population. Oh, there we go. Okay, so in response to Dr. Tucker's question, how does race and racism figure in the context that I work in Africa? Southern Rhodesia was this weird space within the British Empire as what I call a colony, not a colony. It was granted self-government in 1923 and administered by a white settler government. But what happens is that foreign affairs and all legislation relating to racial discrimination is basically still vetted and controlled by London. And so I sort of situate Rhodesia on this colonial continuum between the East African crown colonies and South Africa as a dominion. So then what does this mean for how race worked and operated in Rhodesia? There was sort of a racial hierarchy, but it was more fluid and ambiguous than became the case with the implementation of apartheid in South Africa. So legislation that specifically discriminated against a particular racial group, except when it came to land, was generally not allowed. One piece of legislation in 1908, known as the Asiatics Ordinance, was passed by the white settler government. And what this piece of legislation did was it restricted Asian immigration and called for the registration of all Asian immigrants, and was later disallowed by what was called an imperial ordinance from London. So what the settler government then started doing was using the loophole of economic requirements and factors such as language and literacy requirements for immigrants to prevent further Indian mobility into the country. And that's something we're still seeing today with immigration restrictions around the world, and especially here in the United States. The definition of Asian itself was ambiguous in this legislation. When it comes to education and voting rights, the Indian population was classified as European because this wouldn't have any significant impact. But when it comes to restrictions on things such as liquor and firearms, Indians are instead classified as native or African. So for what are sometimes called in-between minority populations, such as Indians or the Khaleds in southern Rhodesia, which was a term for mixed race peoples, racial definitions were ambiguous and not always well defined. In legislation, the term Asian itself referred to anyone with origins on the Asian continent, but also those from countries such as Sudan and Sudan and Egypt. And these racial definitions were supposedly fixed, but they were transgressed and resisted in very complex ways. And this continues into Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence from Britain in 1965, all the way through to full majority rule in 1980. And Indians as a population are generally seen as middlemen in racial hierarchies in the settler colonies of Africa. But it's far more complicated than that. Indians in Rhodesia and Zimbabwe could identify themselves as Indian and African at the same time. They were part of this British colonial world, but they're also the inheritors of an Indian nationalist legacy at different times, or even sometimes at the same time. They're both settlers, they're colonized peoples, they're collaborators with the colonial system, and part of quotidian and national resistance to ideologies of white supremacy. In the first decades of their migration and settlement, like Gandhi and his work in South Africa, Indians made claims to equal treatment with Europeans as subjects of the British Empire. And the climax of the nationalist movement in India coincided with Indians in the diaspora taking on this identity in resisting the colonial state in Africa. These populations eventually shift towards seeing themselves as citizens of Rhodesia, but sometimes also citizens of the post-colonial Zimbabwe being imagined in the 60s and 70s. So what does this mean exactly? There were two strands of political participation which were closely linked to the claiming of racial identities. So one section of Indians claimed to be Rhodesians first and Asians second, and that was the rhetoric they used. They participated in Rhodesian politics and society, and this was their way of claiming belonging in white spaces. The second strand of political and social thought was a minority, but a significant one. It was made up of Indians who participated in the nationalist movement in Zimbabwe as part of the Zimbabwe Africa People's Union. So on the slide on the left, on my left, is the campaign statement of a man called G. Ismail, who ran as a ward councillor in Salisbury in 1971. On the other side is a picture of Indian and African men detained by the Rhodesian regime. And this is a photo of the detainees, including Joshua Nkomo, at a camp called Gonakudzingwa in 1971. And in terms of Indian involvement in this nationalist movement, my own grandfather was the party's treasurer in the 1960s. And what these Indian businessmen did was use their position as traders to recruit their African customers into the movement. They provided financial backing, and they were able to secure funds from the rest of the Indian trading community, resisting the colonial project altogether. So it's not as simple as being able to say that Indians were this middle group in between black and white. Because their numbers were so small, Indian political participation sort of gets folded into larger movements concerning race and identity rather than constituting a separate faction altogether. So how do histories of state repression and inequality intersect with systemic racism there, and what does activism around the issue have to teach us? So, of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. It took place within institutions that were created to uphold principles of white supremacy, even if the language used to create those institutions did not always state outright that this was about race. Rhodesia was a highly segregated society, if not de jure, then de facto. Land reform in Zimbabwe has been highly controversial, based on principles that, in essence, if not in application, are meant to redress the systemic inequalities of land distribution during the colonial era. By 1898, Rhodesia's 96.25 million acres had been apportioned as follows, and I put the figures on the slide for you. 31 million acres were alienated to Europeans, 21.6 million as native reserves, and 43 million for future allocation. And of this 43 million, 7 million recommended for Africans and 17 million for the white minority. The rest had tsetse flies or no water and thus had no real value. So what has become the focus of more scholarly attention since the 1990s is the history of segregation and resistance to colonialism in urban spaces, not just in rural areas. Unlike the Group Areas Act of Apartheid South Africa, urban spaces were not regulated by federal law. Education was definitely racialized, and children were expected to attend schools allocated for their racial group. But neighborhoods in general were not segregated by law. Instead, it's left to local councils and municipal boards to create rules and regulations around the segregation of urban spaces. And this included public amenities like restaurants and movie theaters and hotels, as well as access to civil service jobs and other professions. The 1950s saw the creation of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which joined together the three Central African territories of now Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. The goal was this creation of a multiracial society, gradually allowing African participation in politics and administration. But the sort of rhetoric and language of multiracialism was a facade that masked the continued entrenchment of segregation in colonial spaces in southern Rhodesia. So what we see is that systemic racism in Rhodesia isn't this all-encompassing project that was able to neatly segregate and create hierarchies of race. Rhodesia's system of segregation traditionally has been seen as just a shadow version of apartheid, and land apportionment certainly was drawn from South Africa's rural land segregation. The reserves in Rhodesia created for African settlement were akin to the Bantustans of South Africa, but were not at any point made into independent homelands. So what I see is that segregation in urban Rhodesia was more akin actually to the Jim Crow laws of the United States. And in fact, several notable challenges to segregation in the 1950s and 1960s in the High Court of Southern Rhodesia, the judges overseeing these cases drew from notable US Supreme Court cases, including Brown versus Board of Education, Dawson versus Baltimore City, and Holmes versus Atlanta. The cases in Rhodesia that were relevant, and I've put them here in case anyone's interested and wants to look them up, were SN Mehta versus the City of Salisbury in 1961 and Chamboko versus the Mabelrain Town Management Board in 1962. The first case of Mehta versus the City of Salisbury was conducted by an Indian man living in the city who challenged restriction of access to the public swimming bath in his neighborhood. He had recently purchased a house in what was seen as a traditionally white neighborhood and claimed that as a ratepayer or taxpayer, he had the right to access the pool. Municipality rules in place aimed to keep non-whites out of white neighborhoods, but the High and Supreme Courts actually ruled in favor of Mehta and granted him access to the swimming bath. And this case became a landmark case in all future legal challenges to segregation. In all these cases, the challenge against segregation and restriction of access to public amenities based on race was based on this consideration of the intangible effects of segregation. Because of ambiguity concerning race in the Constitution, legal challenges to segregation and systemic racism drew from similar challenges happening in the United States. And Indian participation in these challenges and in anti-colonial resistance was, once again, complicated. So on an international platform, what we're seeing happening during the 50s and 60s is that the Indian government dissociated itself from the concerns of the Indian diaspora in Africa, and instead shifted towards becoming a leader in the global anti-colonial struggle. India led the call by the non-aligned movement bloc of newly decolonizing countries for sanctions against South Africa and Rhodesia in the United Nations, and publicly condemned the white settler projects that lingered while the rest of the continent is decolonizing. And this is part of what scholars have termed a series of Bandung moments, or moments of Afro-Asian solidarity and anti-colonialism that took place not only in high politics, but in cultural and social modes of resistance as well. This is seen especially in literature and print culture. One example in Rhodesia was the publication of what was called the Lotus magazine. And it was a monthly publication that was formed by a group of Indian and African civil rights leaders in the city of Bulawayo. The articles were contributed by both Black and Indian writers, highlighting this need for Afro-Asian solidarity against the Rhodesian state. And it was a pretty radical publication for its time and place. This slide shows the contents for one volume from 1955. But both African and Indian writers stressed that political solidarity did not need to involve mixing on a more intimate level. So sports and social interactions were encouraged, but intermarriage was not. There's a lot of scholarship out there, particularly centered on Durban, around the protection of the domestic unit by both Indian and African patriarchs. And similarly, Rhodesia was and remains to a large extent a highly racialized and segregated society because of this history. Miscegenation between Africans and Indians occurred, but not on as public a scale as in, say, South Africa or Kenya. And a lot of Indian insulation in this way had to do with longer traditions of the protection of the family unit. And of course, there's no getting around it. Indians historically displayed racism towards Africans, and I'll get to more of that in a bit. On a broader scale, Indian diplomats held similarly patronizing and racist views. So while they advocated for the end of the Rhodesian regime in public, some Indian diplomats and officials privately admitted to the British that they didn't think Africans were ready for full majority rule. So then that leads to the question, what linkages do I see to the current moment happening right now? And I think what we're seeing here is a global reckoning with colonial pasts and racist institutional foundations. Specifically, a large part of my work confronts anti-Blackness on the part of South Asian communities across the globe. Hassan Minhaj recently gave a forceful monologue on the Patriot Act against the racism of the South Asian diaspora in the United States. I put a link to the video on the slide for anyone who's interested, and I'm happy to share these slides afterwards. Some African scholars, they tend to see racism as a Western construct and European phenomenon. One of my informants once told me that if Asians are being racist sociologically, that's not racism. And instead, he sees a lot of the antagonism between non-white groups in Rhodesia as being the result of class-based antagonisms. And while this is certainly true, it doesn't take into account older pre-colonial forms of colorism and casteism in South Asian history. There's a lot of work out there on the association of social inferiority, as our previous two speakers have highlighted, with darker skin in South Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. And studies of race and caste in India have examined the links between the discriminatory categories of both racism and casteism, and they find ideological origins in the social hierarchy articulated by the Varnas of Hinduism and sort of pre-colonial notions of physical racial differences that are later translated into ideas about purity of blood with the arrival of the Portuguese and then the British after the 16th century. And in turn, these ideas concerning whiteness are then used in the construction of differences between rulers and ruled in colonial India. And these are ideas that are then transferred over to African contexts as well. So Indian ideas concerning racial superiority had both pre-colonial and colonial historical origins, and they're translated into colonial African setting through these communities' interactions with Black and colored populations, both during and after colonialism. And this racism is something the Indian community in Zimbabwe and the South Asian diaspora in general still needs to fully reckon with. And maybe that answer can be found in the ideas of those in Rhodesia who we would now call anti-racist, the members and families of the Indian community who dedicated their lives to the ideals of the Zimbabwean struggle for freedom from white settler rule. On a continental scale, finally, we've been seeing the current moment in action for at least the past decade, if not longer. It began with the Rhodes Must Fall movement by university students in South Africa. Across the continent, there's been a call for the removal of statues of Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi was very much a product of the British Empire. In South Africa, his civil rights activism promoted the rights of Indians within the context of empire rather than for all non-white populations. And some of his more racist writings have been scrutinized by South Asian and South African historians in recent years. And I'm thinking here of the work of Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Wahid. While Gandhi's ideologies and writings were later taken up by African nationalist movements across the continent, and particularly by the ANC in South Africa, his own personal views are extremely problematic. And here we see this conflict between the real Gandhi and Gandhi the legend. And this is another problematic history that needs to be reckoned with. I'll conclude by pointing out that Cecil Rhodes's grave still lies in the Matobo National Park just outside of Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. And I think 40 years after independence, Zimbabwe as a country has yet to fully reckon with the history that is the very reason for its existence. And I think that's something I think we still have a lot of work to do here in the United States, and we'll be continuing to do for a long time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all three presenters for really very, very engaging and I think enlightening and also sometimes provocative presentations. So without further ado, we'll turn to our audience. You can address your question to one person in particular or to all of them, but please use the blue hand function in your participants box.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it. For somebody who doesn't know too much about the issue of race with regard to Arab racism and the like. My question is for the first speaker, Khaled Esseissah. Thank you for the education about Mauritania. My immediate question has to do with your claim that racism is not sanctioned by the state in Mauritania, so we cannot talk about apartheid in that way. But then you also said something about the fact that racism is not institutionalized. And I want you to elaborate on that a bit, especially with regard to the educational system and maybe some other social institutions in the society. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. So what I meant by the law, there is no law that says, that legalize racial and social discrimination between ethnic groups in Mauritania. What happened with the state, and and especially this in the context of where I mentioned Biram Dahu al-Abeid, the prominent anti-slavery activist who talks about Mauritania as an apartheid system in Northwest Africa. There is no law that exists that prohibits people from interacting in a school or that sort of things doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that there is no social, racial, economic discrimination that non-Arabophone groups that are felt that there is a lot of injustice that is done to them. That's real, and no one is denying that. And I'm not here trying to deny that. I'm just clarifying the fact that it's not mandated by law. Racism is not mandated by law. That's what happened in the United States in the past or in South Africa. But there is real social discrimination that exists in the ground. And when I talk about the educational system, there is no law that says, the Arabic is the official language in Mauritania, but there's no law that prohibits teaching for instance, the Wolof or the Pular or the Soninke. These languages can be taught. There is no law that prohibits that. There is no law that prohibits non-Arabophone group in Mauritania to run for office. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of non-Arabophone who are part of the government, who have, since the independence, have occupied higher positions in the government and who also have participated in the marginalization of their own people and their own ethnic groups. There are a lot of members of the what is called the Harāṭīn, that is usually defined as former slaves and former slaves. Even that terminology is problematic, but I'm not going to get into that. There are a lot of those who also occupy important positions. As a matter of fact, recently the prime minister come from that. The actual prime minister who was recently nominated, appointed by the president, is part of that community that is often discussed as victims of slavery and social discrimination. So there is real problems that needs to be addressed. And these high officials that occupy important positions from non-Arabophone groups, but also from the Harāṭīns, I think this is an issue, but I think this is not real addressing the real problems. This is more like a window dressing changes that the government does here and there, but they're not really addressing the inequalities and the problems. So what I meant by that, and I apologize if I did not make myself clear, is there is no law that legalize racism in Mauritania, but it's real. It's a lived experience, and there are real problems that needs to be addressed, and I think that's why I think this event is important. So that's what I want to say about that.
Thank you. We had Abdullah Rahman had his hand up. Are you still interested in asking a question?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So if I may, I have like two questions, one to Dr. Khaled, another to soon to be Dr. Patel. So is that okay? May I ask these two questions?
Yes, please,
okay.
Go ahead.
So Dr. Khaled, nice to see you after a while. I used to be in Bloomington. So, well, you mentioned quickly about that how even in the US, among the Arabs or Muslims, there is like not much talk about this issue of racism, etc. Now, what do you think? Like, although from people who came from Africa or from the Arab world or even Indian subcontinent, even if they came with some of those ideas in the US, is it becoming better? Are people getting more like, say, not the first generation immigrants, but their children? Are they getting out of that notion of skin color or etc.? And if I may ask the other question to Dr. Patel also, maybe that same thing. I'm originally from the Indian subcontinent, and you kind of like mentioned about the Indian population in Zimbabwe, the issue of how Indians used to think about Africans. But what about the issue of caste that Indians had? Like, did that have any impact? Like among Indians in Rhodesia having some sort of, it's not exactly racism, but this, like, did it have any impact on how Indians looked at, like a lower caste Indian, would they be feeling more closer to an African than versus a Brahman or something? So I'll stop here, and whoever wants to take the answer first.
Dr. Esseissah, you want to begin?
All right. Thank you so much for that question. It's good to see you. Well, I think this issue it's not going to get away because of this is a second generation of immigrants who are growing up in America, and that's gonna solve the problem. If that's gonna solve the problem, it would have solved the problem that already exists. Immigration is not new. People have been migrating to the United States for a long time, and still we have issues with racism and all of that. So I think that's not the issue. I think the issue is going to be solved only if we have the courage and the audacity among Muslim community to address it, and to address it going beyond that, just like I said, that's mentioning and citing the hadith and and the Quran. These are very useful if they are the Quran is explicitly, like I said, talks about, the equality between human beings, between the different groups and races. But unless we, within the Muslim community, the imams, the leaders of the community have the courage to address these issues, because I talk to a lot of Africans, I talk to a lot of, African Americans, who are struggling even with the idea of just getting married. When you're trying to, I have spoken with an African American who recently accepted Islam, and he told me, he left that, he's no longer part of that society because he's now a Muslim, and he's trying to be a good Muslim, practice his Islam, and they're trying to get married to a Muslim woman. And he met this Somali girl, and she fell in love with him, and they went to get married. He went to her parents, and their parents said, no, don't bring us shame. That's exactly what they told us. So there are a lot of issues that I think, being part of the Muslim community in America and participating in that conversation, I think I haven't seen a lot of discussion and people trying to address this issue. And I think what I see right now is, at least that I see khutbah in the Friday, I see sermons where imams are talking about it. And not talking about it like shifting the blame on mainstream American society and saying racism because of white racism and all of that. No, they're talking about it and trying to address racism that exists within Muslim community. And I think that's a step forward, and I think that's important. So I'll stop here and yeah.
Okay. Yes, almost Dr. Patel.
Yes, I can take the question. That felt weird to hear. But yes, in terms of the caste system, that's very much prevalent in the Indian community in Rhodesia. And what you see is these immigrants take with them sort of imagined ideas about their caste institutions, and they take them with them. And what happens is that these ideas don't really evolve once they've left the South Asian subcontinent. And it comes into play particularly when it comes to marriage. So once you start bringing your children over and they grow up and you need to marry them off, you start thinking then about caste and the protection of the family unit centered on ideas of caste. And because of this, I think we don't see a lot of miscegenation in Rhodesia between Indians and Africans. But the miscegenation that does take place is actually between Muslims and between Africans, because the Islamic community in Rhodesia isn't bound by these ideas of caste as much as the Hindu community is. And what happens is that this then becomes a sort of class difference between Indians who marry within their communities and Indians who marry outside their communities. And you see these class differences articulated, especially in education, because schools are reserved for either Asian children or colored children, or sometimes for both. And there are a lot of Indian patriarchs, especially in the 1940s, who want to create what they call purity schools based on this idea of purity of blood. And so then they argue that, the children of Muslim fathers and African women can't attend these schools and should attend schools meant for colored populations. So you see a lot of that dialogue happening then. And unfortunately, ideas about caste still prevalent amongst my generation. People are aware of the caste group that they come from. My parents are from an intercaste marriage, and I'm still very aware of it. So it's something that's still very prevalent today when thinking about things like marriage and social interactions.
Thank you. Dr. Adeli, did you want to ask your question, or should
I noticed there were others in the chat, if you prefer to take them first.
Okay. Okay, should I do that? So the first one I think is from Muhammad Azad. Do you think the different forms of slavery, debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, and so forth between the Middle East and the Americans had an impact on racism in these societies? Yeah, please, Dr. Trapp-Powell. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the question, although it's very well written. In other words, I guess I'm asking if was there some kind of hierarchy of identities or hierarchy in terms of racial identities based on what kind of slavery people were brought into the Middle Eastern societies of American society?
I can explain. Sorry. So I think what I'm trying to say is that, like, in different types of slavery, there was like freedom of movement. In other forms of slavery, there was not freedom of movement, freedom to get married, freedom to have. So slavery is not one concept of slavery, and I think this concept of slavery was different in different parts of the world. And I just wonder if different forms of slavery had different impacts on the ideas of racism that came afterwards.
I'll just take a quick stab. Maybe stab is not the right word to use. I do think that I've been studying a lot about Haitian history lately, and it is really interesting to see in the Haitian, first in the Great Slave Uprising of Saint-Domingue, and then what became Haitian independence, that the differences in slavery and in terms of who was accepted within the white household as a member of it and who wasn't, and had a huge impact on the legacy of slavery and racism in Haiti. Mulattoes took on a role, and I don't like the term mulattoes, but that was what they were called. That was very, very different than those who had been recently enslaved, and the question of color, and one's affinity within how deeply people suffered from slavery was very much a part of what happened in Haiti. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, you certainly see, if you look at, young boys who were taken from Sudan, for instance, and were castrated and became eunuchs and rose to often the highest levels in the imperial palace, or, that makes a different kind of legacy. Although what is very interesting is that these eunuchs recognized often their own, once they retired, and had neighborhoods in Cairo where they worked to help each other save up for their retirement. So there was definitely a question about a shared identity there. But it's a really good question. I mean, to just think about the different ways in which slavery manifests, and then the different kinds of legacies. I would still say, though, that it doesn't erase the racism. It doesn't erase the racism. And part of what is very pernicious about racism is that if some are more favored than others, it just complicates freedom and constructions of freedom. So,
thank you.
Okay. Should we move there? Shireen Saidi had a question, noticing that several speakers began their talk by making clarifications on their identity and wondering if you see a distinction between clarification on identity, positionality, and the pursuit of authenticity. How do we make this distinction in our teaching, writing, presentation? Is it time that we confront this question of authenticity in the field? Big question. I think that's probably for everyone, all our panelists, if whoever wishes to engage it.
I can take a try at that one. For me, it's important to identify why I got into this research in the first place, because it wasn't something I studied initially. It's only as I pursued my graduate career that I realized telling the history of my own ancestors was important. And it's also a question of then sort of addressing the questions I know I'll get about my bias, right? And how close I am to the subject, and whether I'm then able to take a step back and, view the whole context of the situation that I'm studying. And it is a very valid question. But for me, I think what I want to do is to engage with other scholars who are discussing the same issues of race and segregation in Southern Africa, or, in general. And for me, I think a true sort of decolonization of the academy, which is a term that's been used lately, can only take place when historians and scholars from these communities engage with scholars from the West, right? And I think for me, it's important to then identify myself as part of that conversation. And a lot of that has to do with honesty, right? I acknowledge in my own dissertation, in my cover letters for jobs, in grant applications, what my positionality is within the topic that I'm studying. And I think that sort of honesty, which we've been lacking lately, is something that is needed.
Any other, should we, yes,
No,
please.
Now, I want to briefly say this, and then, yeah, I think it's a valid question. It's a very important question. But for me, growing up in this context, I come from this community that is considered the Harāṭīn community. This history is sort of needs this work needs to be done, and there is a lot of needs to be done, and there are scholars who have done work on the Harāṭīn community, but I think there is more to be done, especially for people who come from this group who bring an insider's perspective. And I recognize there might be biases and there might be issues, but I think an insider also brings an original perspective sometimes that is lacking in the literature. And I think it's very important. And being honest about my identity and who I am, I think, and being clear about that, I think, is a lot. And I think this is valid for all of us. What we study as scholars is things that we are passionate about, things we care about. And sometimes that intersects with our own identity, personal identity, and sometimes that's not the case. But most of the time, when we are studying these issues, we study them because we care about them and we are invested in them, and we want to bring solutions, and we want to bring these issues to the forefront. So I think that's why I wanted to be, to talk about my identity, and there are disadvantages for being an insider, but also there are advantages. So that's all what I want to say briefly about that.
Okay. So, yes, Eve, please go ahead.
Very, very briefly. I agree with both Trish and Khaled about that completely, and I feel that I have to share it. But I have asked some of my non-Black colleagues whether they feel this way, and my white colleagues whether they feel that they have to share, and whether people ask them this question, and they don't feel that pressure. Okay. And so I think that's important to remember. Who are we questioning or thinking about? Authenticity and self-identity. And I still think if you are a white professor, these questions are not necessarily asked of you, nor do you feel that you have to answer them.
Okay, great. I'm mindful of the time, so I think we only have time for one last question. And I think I have in the queue Sarah Cope.
Hello. Thank you to all of the speakers. One of the things that I was curious about as you were speaking about in some ways the dimensions of slavery and also colonialism, if you could talk a bit more about some of the ways that economic factors have enabled the sort of persistence of these kinds of prejudices. And I know, for example, in Zimbabwe, with everything that Britain did in the financial disenfranchisement, with the pound and everything like that, but how that's perpetuated.
Sarah, I think we're losing.
And then also, if you have a moment. Oh, Paul, is that better?
It is, yes.
Sorry, I'm in a odd old house. I was wondering about the sort of the economic aspects that you think enable this kind of the perpetuation of racism, but specifically sort of in these specific countries, and with an eye perhaps to colonialism. And then just sort of perhaps as an adjunct, if there's something you want white scholars, white students, and your white colleagues, as you mentioned in the last question, sort of that idea of identification, if there are things that we as white people who have a interest in the field can do to make more space and to make our contributions and questions more appropriate and more sound.
Okay. So would everybody, this is probably our last, we're running a little bit over time, but if it's all right for brief responses from our panelists, if you feel so moved. Yeah.
Go ahead,
please.
Eve.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll say very quickly that I think it's a great question, and I do think that economic circumstances have a huge role to play. And if we think about where we see a lot of expressions of racism in places like Egypt or in Lebanon, or a lot of this has to do with who come as refugees to these countries and who come as domestic workers. And I think that there's so much domestic work that is done by women who are African, who find themselves caught up in the kafala system or all of this, for whom their vulnerability is huge because of their economic vulnerability. That's very important.
I want to briefly to say that Sarah, she's my student, so I got free access. You get free access to me, so we can talk about it. So later, I don't want to hold anybody yet. So.
Okay. That's nice. Yeah. Did you want to have a final remark, Trish? Yeah.
Sure. Very briefly, if you've been following any of the news in Zimbabwe at all, I think the current economic crisis stems from the fact that the colonial systems and institutions that were in place before 1980 haven't been changed. They've essentially carried all the way over. So now it's just a different government sort of creating the same systemic economic inequalities that were in place before, which actually has created a movement called Zimbabwean Lives Matter, where the opposition movement has taken this slogan on sort of in their campaign for freedom from these from systemic economic and political repression.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I really do apologize that we have now tons of questions in the queue and we can't get to them. So I would encourage everybody to contact the speakers individually, who I'm sure will show equal generosity as they've shown today. And so I do want to thank all three of our speakers for really a very significant, engaging, enlightening panel. I also do want to shout out to colleagues in African and Arab Studies, Fidet Adeli, Rochelle Davis, and Laura Smith, who were really instrumental in putting this event together. I speak for all of us, I think, when I say how much we've learned about engaging race and racism in the Middle East region, as well as closer to home, actually. And so many thanks to everyone, and I will have to call the event to a close. Thank you so much. Yeah.